Hi folks, welcome to Lecture 4, International Political Economy. This week we're going to cover the Great Depression and its causes and some of its effects. So you might notice that I've slipped the Great Depression topic in. I didn't previously have it, and it's not in the topic guide, but these things happen when you're building a new course. So we're going to tackle the Great Depression in this lecture. Okay, so what we'll cover is I want to look at explain the changes in military strategy, or the technology, and the system of warfare changed dramatically in World War I, and it's kind of important. And then the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations and the post-war settlement, the hyperinflation of the rebuilding phase, and then the Roaring '20s boom that leads into the Great Depression, and just want to briefly cover Fascism and Communism and social democracy, the three economic systems that came out of the Great Depression. So international relations as a department in a university, as a field of study, the first two departments were formed in 1919 in the US and the UK. So immediately after World War I, what was then known as the Great War, and thought it would be the war to end all wars, it was so destructive. Little did they know that World War II was about to happen. But the idea in these two departments, the idea was that prior to World War I, war and the politics between nations had been studied as history, diplomatic history, and war was studied as history. And maybe if you were in a military university, military college, you studied the strategies as a way of learning to win wars. But the new idea, the break from the past that these two departments of international relations brought, was that instead of studying international politics as history, these international relations departments were tasked with the goal of studying politics between countries, but also war between countries, but not as a way of winning it, but as a way of avoiding it, stopping any more great wars. So the genesis of international relations as a field really starts with this reaction to World War I, and this really normative, hopeful aim of understanding why states fall into wars, and perhaps that might give us some tools to avoid wars. And it's called international relations rather than international politics, because politics sort of stops when countries go to war, right? Instead of the negotiation and the interactions that are part of politics, if you go to war, then you're using the blunt instrument of military force to decide an issue. So they called it international relations because they wanted to study war as well, right? That was really a key element of this new field. So to start with World War I, I want you to understand how much of a break World War I was from all previous wars, really. So records from archaeological digs show quite strong evidence that as far back as we can go, humans have always banded together in groups and gone to war with other groups, right? And so that is in the historical record going back as far as we can go, right? And at least for European history, and this whole course really will be quite European focused, unfortunately. However, the European history was continual warfare, through all the ages, right? So probably records going back to about 7,000 years ago. Right? But what made World War I different was that prior to the 1860s, war was a relatively quick and uncostly enterprise, right? Or at least battles were. So what war was like before World War I was that you spent a lot of time marching your people around to try and find the other army, right? To try and have this sort of decisive battle. And then once you found each other, quite often both sides would make camp. Both sides would maybe spend set up tents and sleep over, and then in the morning they would charge at each other, and by the end of the day, one side would have surrendered, and they'd be signing a peace treaty in the winner's tent, right? And yes, you might have lost 40,000 men, but it wasn't 40 million, right? That it wasn't every male for an entire generation from a country, right? So reasonably controlled costs. Right? And so here we see the 6 classic military maneuvers, and at least in terms of organized military attacks. So all of them, going from the top left to the bottom right, so you have flanking on one or both sides. The second one is you try and charge through the center. The third one is get to a strong defensive position and then counterattack. So when your enemy is exhausted, right, from attacking you because of your good defensive position, then you counterattack. Or you can have a feigned retreat that envelops the attacker, or you attack with all your strength on one side, right? Or you have an extreme flanking maneuver where you send your cavalry around the back. So all of these are really trying to just break the lines of your enemy, right? Warfare all the way up until all the way up to World War One was really lines of men running at each other and fighting and trying to break through that line so that you can easily kill the enemy as they're fending off attacks from the front. You can get them from behind. And that's basically what war was leading up to World War One. But this changed with the invention of the Gatling gun, so the first machine gun, really. Plus, you had, so the Gatling gun could mow down hundreds, thousands of men and horses before they could rush that line, right? You couldn't line up. You could line up 1,000 men, a kilometre away or 500 metres away, and have them all run at that gun, and the Gatling gun could kill them all before any of them was able to get there and destroy that gun or break the line. Right? Plus, you had trench warfare in the soft clay soil of eastern France. Right? Plus, you had the invention of barbed wire. Right? Plus, you had the invention of long-range artillery. So, and you had train lines quickly resupplying men, bullets, artillery, barbed wire, food, water, etc. The train was able to make your resupply just constant and seamless, right? So in World War One, for the first time, you had the tactics of the age-old tactics of war, where you line your men up and run at the other guy's line. Suddenly, it didn't work, right? No matter how courageous your men were, they couldn't climb over the barbed wire and get to the Gatling gun before the Gatling gun killed them all. Right? So this is the line of control, the line between France and Germany's forces that quickly ground to a halt in World War One, and this trench warfare, sort of the lines, as each side tried to flank the other, going by the traditional playbook, right? Okay, we've got to, if we can't break through, we've got to flank them, right? So these flanking maneuvers just were met with trench defences, and so you had a zipping up of a line that went all the way from the Swiss Alps all the way to the ocean, right? And that's where the line stayed, right, for the whole war. It was just both sides experimenting with how many men they could throw at these Gatling guns, and both sides realizing that they couldn't break the lines. Right? So just a tragic meat grinder of a war where old strategies were made redundant in the face of new technology. So this new type of warfare was such a shock to the whole world, and I mean obviously focused on the European world at the time, but it was such a shock because this is not how war was supposed to be, right? Wars were short and sharp conflicts that decided an issue, right? And war was even sort of seen as this institution where it was a tool to use when politics broke down, and it was politics by other means. But it was supposed to be short and sharp and relatively painless, right? Okay, you might lose 10, 20, 40,000 men, but you wouldn't lose 40 million, right? And it wasn't just the destruction of whole generations of men, but also the destruction of the entire country, right? With artillery and grenades and and firebombing. You've got in World War I, it destroyed France, right? You got this massive destruction, and so it was just this massive shock to the system where they've decided to go to war and they thought they'd be home by Christmas, but it drags on for 4 brutal years and kills tens of millions and destroys the entire country. Right? So not only do you have the soldiers dying, but you have civilians starving to death and homes, countries, cities destroyed. So out of that horrible war came this real anti-war sentiment for the first time. Like it used to be that countries would cheer on their armies, and you even had people demonstrating in the street calling for their country to go to war, right? Because it was not something that affected the normal person, right? It was an elite thing that the kings and princes and his troops did, and it was like what modern day soccer is for us, right? It didn't really matter which king won some battle in some field. You're, as a peasant, you're still going to pay your taxes to the king, whoever that is, right? This was different. This destroyed everything, everyone, right? A complete meat grinder. So that changed the sentiment of populations and leaders to being very anti-war. So before the war ended, Russia has a Bolshevik revolution and quits the war. But then the trench warfare, the lines were broken eventually, partially, with something that was called a creeping barrage, where artillery fire would they would time it so that artillery fire kept the machine gunners' heads down while the men ran over the top, and obviously had to time that pretty well. But Germany was not defeated. It was an armistice, right? So just a cessation of warfare. It wasn't a surrender by no means. But when the armistice brought an end to the war, the US President Woodrow Wilson championed the idea of a League of Nations, and the reason why his ideas were listened to by the European powers was that the economic impact of World War I changed the balance of power in the world dramatically. In particular, the economic balance of power. So during the first 3 years of World War I, when the US was neutral, the European powers withdrew from their colonies, obviously distracted from trade and empire by survival and war, and the US was drawn into that vacuum, right? So suddenly you saw US businesses everywhere, and so it was actually boom times for the US. US exports doubled in those first 3 years. And not only is the US exporting to the developing world, the Allies need US manufactured goods, materials, weapons, munitions, food. So just an absolute boom time for the US. And as the war dragged on in its new total format, right, where this was not a limited affair, right? The survival of countries, states, maybe even societies are at stake. The Allied powers quickly ran out of gold and US dollars, and so they had to sell things to get US dollars and to fund their war effort. So the US government wouldn't lend them any money as they had declared neutrality. Right? So the UK initially bought, but then simply requisitioned UK citizens' overseas stocks and bonds and businesses and real estate, and sold them to US investors for dollars, and then spent that money on supplies. The investment house JP Morgan was used to sell war bonds to private American investors on behalf of the UK government. And so by the end of those 3 years, the British hold on its colonies was really diminished, and they were running out of money and debts were racking up, and that they had stripped, the US had stripped them of everything, right? So, or a lot anyway. And so when the US finally entered the war and declared war on Germany, they provided a government-to-government loan, that fixed the supply problems for the Allies. And that loan was nearly $10 billion, right? So by the time the US enters the war, what's not directly sold to US investors was overrun by US exports and competing US businesses, whereas previously the colonies were sort of the imperial network sort of kept them out, and the US filled the gaps everywhere, and British economic leadership in particular, as the main source of investment funds outside of Europe, slipped away in those 3 years and was replaced by US investment dollars and businesses and goods, and so a very dramatic change from the 100 years or so of British dominance. So at the end of World War I, we had the creation of the League of Nations, which is really a remarkable attempt at bringing all countries together to provide security, all for one and one for all, right? It was supposed to be this mutual security pact where if any one country attacked another, then all of the countries would would come to the defence of the weak, right? And so the League was about global disarmament and a global military alliance, right? And so these photos are from the Paris Peace Conference, where all the major powers, including the US, signed a series of treaties. And the main two were the Treaty of Versailles and the treaty creating the League of Nations. And the Treaty of Versailles was the large monetary compensation that France and Britain demanded that Germany pay for being the attacker in the war, which turned out to be far too punishing and on the German people, and it just allowed the rise of the extremist Hitler on a platform of, we're not going to pay, and we've been harshly dealt with by the winners. And the League of Nations was a treaty that aimed at global disarmament and plus this collective responsibility for everyone to come to the aid of any country that was attacked. However, so it was supposed to be this this global alliance, this global military alliance, but this was very different from a normal military alliance, right? Where you pledge to come to the aid of an alliance partner. Normal military alliances are in response to a mutual threat. And what holds the alliance together is not the heroism and the self-sacrificing nature of the partners, but instead the alliance is held together by a mutual interest, a mutual threat. So it's actually built on self-interest. So the problem with a global military alliance is if one state attacks another state, then the self-interest of most members will be to stay out of the war, right? Not join it. And certain critics of the League of Nations idea labelled this disregard for the real self-interested motivations that drive states. These critics labelled the League of Nations and its supporters as idealists or idealism, believing in a utopian future where there was no more war because we all simply promised not to, right? And so these critics labelled themselves as realists. So the League of Nations immediately ran into problems when the US Congress refused to ratify the treaty, fearing that they would be drawn into more of Europe's continual wars. And so despite the US President Woodrow Wilson being the champion of this League of Nations, he was the driving force, he couldn't get it through his own Congress. And so despite this, the isolationist Congress refused to ratify it, and so immediately you've got the most powerful country, the advocate of this global military alliance, dropping out, right? And as well as this, the original promise for nations to begin disarming did not have any details or plans for how and when that should happen. So this needed more negotiation, which never resulted in any sort of disarmament agreements. And all the while, everyone is still building weapons, right? Especially Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. So while this is all going on in the 1920s and 30s, the realists within academia are presenting an argument or a theory as to why we can't just trust other states to be peaceful, right? In particular, a man called E.H. Carr wrote a very powerful critique of the idealism or the utopianism of the League, and E.H. Carr is really the start of realism, or what we now call classical realism. within the subject of international relations. So at the end of World War I, the map of Europe changed pretty dramatically as the Austrian-Hungary Empire disappeared, was split up, as did the Ottoman Empire, and Russia became the Soviet Union. Central and Eastern Europe was in chaos, heavy destruction, right? Suddenly there were countries that hadn't existed previously, right? Czechoslovakia, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Yugoslavia, Finland, and Austria and Hungary had now become separate, quite small states. And all of these countries started from scratch, right? Organizing their governments and starting rebuilding, and they obviously had no money to pay for anything, right? They had no reserves or even taxes, right? So of course they print money, right? Unfortunately, increasing your money supply when there is a supply shock, right? So shortages that can't be quickly solved, or shortages that the economy can't simply produce more of. Printing money in that situation causes inflation, right? And not the gradual inflation that everyone was used to, and is actually a good thing. This needed a new word, right? So it was coined hyperinflation. Most countries in Central and Eastern Europe suffered some level of hyperinflation. So not the 5 or 10% that you would call inflation, but hyperinflation. So the Czechs and Finland and Yugoslavia, Greece, all saw their currencies lose 90-95% of their value, or prices in terms of other things go up by 95%. Right? But they were the lucky ones by far. Austria saw their prices rise by 14,000 times. Hungary saw their prices rise by 23,000 times. So what cost, one Hungarian forint, or what I think that's their currency. So what cost one forint originally, say a cup of coffee, by the end of those years, it now costs 23,000 forints. Right? And they still had it much better than Poland and Russia. Poland's prices went up by 2.5 million, and Russia's increased by 4 billion. So just crazy stuff. But that's still nothing compared to Germany's hyperinflation, because the German reparations was taking all of the gold out of the country, right? The gold that was needed to pay for imports. The parts of the reparations that could be paid in German marks meant that there was an incentive to just print money to pay that. So before this hyperinflation event, a German mark was worth $1. So $1 would get you 4.2 marks. But by the end of the hyperinflation, $1 would get you 4.2 trillion marks, right? So, or that cup of coffee has gone from 4.2 marks to 4.2 trillion marks. It's hard to imagine what that's like, but it wouldn't have been nice. So crazy stuff like getting paid in the morning and rushing out to buy your food because by the afternoon your money's worthless, right? It would really destroy the incentive for working, right? And that's not the worst of it, right? The very wealthy were able to get their money out of these currencies or into gold or whatever, but the middle class, so your farmers and small businessmen, tradesmen, right? They all lost their life savings, right? All gone to zero. Wiped them out, and really destroyed Germany's trust in this new democratic form of government. In fact, let me read you a quote from a Berlin businessman from the time. "The inflation put a miserable end to all my efforts. I couldn't pay my people, my assets melted away. Once again we experienced hunger. On the basis of this experience, I fled from the government that permitted such misery. I joined the Nazi Party and became a stormtrooper." So, end quote. So we see how moderates can become radicals when their livelihoods are destroyed. So by the 1924. By 1924, the inflation had been beaten back, and with rebuilding well underway and inflation under control in Europe, the global economy started to get going again and even boom in the late 20s. But this new boom was a very different kind of, or the structure of the economy was very different after this. In the century before World War I, the structure of the economy was virtually all small businesses, right? Small farms in particular. And even with the Industrial Revolution creating larger and larger factories, it wasn't until after World War I that we saw the emergence of very large corporations. And so corporations that are doing more than just running a factory and producing a thing, right? You know, producing cloth or producing shirts. What emerged is what we call vertically integrated corporations. And so here we see formerly independent operations being brought under one roof, right? So instead of paying an independent company to do, say, your research, they might sell that research to a competitor as well as you, right? So you bring your research in-house, right? And that goes for all your inputs, right? And because you're building very complex things, right? A washing machine or a fridge or a car, right? The inputs that go into a car are numerous, right? And because you've got the invention of the production line by Ford in the early 1900s, and so that's being refined and scaled up, and the new manufactured goods required a new organization, right? So instead of a company concentrating on one key activity, the new manufacturing corporations found they needed to bring together hundreds of separate components to build something like a car, and each component had to be supplied at just the right time, at the right cost, and at the right quality, and the whole process, right, could be held to ransom by one small supplier of something. So to remove that, these companies expanded to take over their entire supply chain, and down to selling the products as well, right? So all of this created extreme economies of scale and massive, massive corporations for the first time, right? Corporations that were very powerful, not only economically, but also politically. And in response to the growing size and power of corporations, the factory workers organised, and we see the rise of unions and the working class as an economic consideration and a political force in democratic elections. The working class political parties tended towards socialism, obviously, and everywhere there wasn't every democracy suddenly had an identifiable left wing to their democratic politics, right? And the unions used strikes to force big business to provide better working conditions and higher wages. And women's suffrage was enacted throughout all the democracies, first in Australia though. Right? But the middle class, so the farmers, tradesmen and small businesses, they were actually crushed by the continued encroachment of big business, making many of their skills and small businesses obsolete, right? And by the union's ability to keep wages high. Right? So why would you work on the farm if you can go work in a factory and earn twice as much, right? And by cheap imports. So while the working class tended to flock to the left parties, the farmers and small businessmen and tradesmen tended to lean towards right and really formed the basis for the rise of fascist parties later on. But by the late 1920s, the US dollar's investment and loans was fueling a worldwide economic boom. Right? So the US had replaced the UK as the economic hegemon, right? But unfortunately, unlike the UK, who had spent 100 years being very involved, they were ever present everywhere to prop up banks and to manage economies, and they had a very broad vision of what their responsibilities were, right? The US did not fill their shoes, right? So even though US business and banks were investing all over the place and giving loans and credit to Brazilian wheat farmers and Australian cattlemen and things like that, and really fueling a boom, the government was not really involved in any of this. Right? And so, but it was a boom time, right? And in fact, it was such a boom in so many different countries. There's different names for it in different countries, right? Like they've given it a proper name. So in Germany, it was called the Weimar Renaissance, and in Britain it's called the Baldwin Age, and in Latin America it's called the Dance of the Millions. And of course in the US it's called the Roaring Twenties. Though the US did have prohibition at the time, but that doesn't seem to have stopped them partying. So there's an investment boom being fueled by US dollars and around the world, and the world really rushes back to gold, right? To the gold standard. And it feels like the good times are here again, right? If the pre-World War I laissez-faire gold standard days are back, right? But the economist John Maynard Keynes was alarmed. And so he's saying that the economy is simply not adjusting as it had before World War I. Right? He said that to apply the principles of an economics which was worked out on the hypothesis of laissez-faire and free competition to a society which is rapidly abandoning those principles is exceedingly dangerous. The way small traders and farmers had to respond to the market, matching price and wage drops to market conditions, was completely different to the massive monopolistic corporations that the 1920s had. And those companies didn't need to cut prices or profits and didn't respond to austerity or interest rate rises or even government direction as previous sort of smaller factories and farmers did. Right? And the newly unionised workforce could refuse to have their wages cut, or they'd strike or vote governments out. So the ability of the market and government to force prices and wages down easily in order to maintain a fixed exchange rate, that had sort of completely evaporated. And Keynes was warning that the gold standard would no longer work in the way that it had done before World War I. But that wasn't obvious while the global economy was booming, and it really was booming. The end of the boom started quite gently. There was bad crops in many of the non-European, and in the United States, and Europe and Asia went into a slight downturn in their overall economies, but the US was still booming, and so investment money started to flow back from the world to the US economy because it was getting better returns, and it seemed safer. If there's a little bit of a downturn coming, well, in Brazil, you want to take your money out of Brazil and bring it home to the US, right? That's booming. So in 1927, the net outflow of funds from the US was something like $900 billion. But by 1930, it had reduced to only 86 million. So a massive contraction in credit and investment. Right? And since World War I destroyed the Europeans, the world was completely reliant on US banks and investors for credit. You can't expand a business or even buy stock to sell if you don't have access to credit, right? So if the credit stops, then a lot of business just can't function, right? And you certainly don't see an expansion. So that caused a lot of businesses and economies around the world to sort of start grinding to a halt, and that's what started to happen to the global economy in 1929. Investors sold off foreign currencies and to convert them to US dollars to invest in the US market, and so this made foreign currencies fall relative to the dollar in value. And the gold standard is key here. The classical gold standard government playbook is that when your currency is being sold off, you must retain the value of your currency relative to the gold peg, right, to your fixed rate. So what you have to do is you have to raise interest rates in order to attract foreign investors and their dollars, and you impose austerity in order to push down domestic wages and prices so that your economy's exports become cheaper. And so people start not only investing in your banks or because of the high interest rates, but also buying your goods, right? And you have to buy your currency to buy your goods because they're cheaper. So the value of your currency goes back up and you maintain your peg. So that's how you maintain your gold peg. unfortunately, just as Keynes had warned, business was now big business, and so they did not respond to interest rate rises with price cuts and cutting profit. Instead, they just cut production, and the unions also resisted wage cuts, especially because there is a disconnect between the interests of remaining workers, right, the people that are still employed, who want to keep their wages high, and unemployed workers who would want wages cut so that so they can get a job. So prices and wages had become sticky, and the gold standard wasn't working anymore. And in fact, it worked against stabilisation, because rising interest rates and imposing austerity, right, turned a mild recession in Europe into a full-blown depression. And the lack of US leadership is really important. It sort of caused a lot of problems, or made things much worse. Whereas previously the British had been everywhere, right, propping up banks and governments and pulling together loans for this too big to fail thing, or government, or etc. Right. The US wasn't interested in that, and and in fact the returning investment dollars returning to the US pushed the US stock market up, and the US Federal Reserve wanted to curb what it saw as a speculative bubble. So it raised interest rates, right? But by raising interest rates, it made the outflow of funds from Europe worse, right? It made their currency devalue more. And the Fed thought its only responsibility was maintaining the fixed rate to gold. And so it raised rates again in August of 1929, and continued to do that through the Depression, through the beginnings of the Depression. And raising rates in the US did stop the stock market bubble, but because demand for US exports had collapsed, instead of a gentle landing, the stock market burst, the stock market bubble burst, and we have the infamous 1929 stock market crash. As the reality of the economic situation emerges, panicked investors, lots of mum and pa investors too, right? So again, your middle class, they all try to get the money out of shares. The stock market crashes, and it wasn't just shares crashing. As the world's factory since World War I, the US economy relied on demand for their exports. So with it drying up, the prices of everything went into free fall, hence depression. The raw materials and commodities producing countries like Australia, Brazil, Argentina, and Canada were especially hard hit by the reducing demand and the fall in currencies, and so they responded either formally or informally reasonably quickly and took their currencies off the gold standard, so they could devalue their currency and maintain their export competitiveness, and it also makes importing more expensive, so it helps their domestic economies. However, the industrial economies of Europe and the US stuck with the gold standard playbook of how to respond to domestic price declines, which was to do nothing, right? Like, price declines is what's supposed to happen. They're seen as beneficial. It's the business cycle is seen at the top of it, you've had foolish investment into unproductive things, and a price decline and a short, sharp recession liquidates all that bad investment and returns it to something good. So that's the classical theory anyway. And the playbook is that governments should not only do nothing about price declines, but they should force prices and wages down faster with austerity and tax rises and increasing interest rates, right, to make it a short, sharp correction to restore balance. So as US employment hits 24% in October 1931, the US Fed Reserve is increasing interest rates, right? So it takes it from 1.5 to 3.5 in a single week, right? So really putting the brakes on any loans or investment, right? And the austerity imposed, so that's really just crashed these economies and sent unemployment skyrocketing in all the industrial countries. And by 1933, so that's the 5th year of this downturn, in the US, unemployment's hit 25%, and that's conservative, right? Because it doesn't include married women. Married women weren't allowed to work, right? So for each one of those unemployed people, that's a whole household, right? Like, and 5 years was well past the time when according to the classical theories, the gold standard playbook, 5 years was well past the time that the economy should have regained balance. And even according to previous gold standard experience, right? And the decline was epic, right? Like the 1933, by 1933, the US economy had contracted by more than 30%. So just devastating. People began to be scared that the bank that their money was in would fail and they would lose their money. So everyone started taking their money out of banks, causing banks to fail, right? So vicious self-fulfilling prophecies there. So banks started to fail, and these bank failures spread around the world over the next 3 or 4 years. In December 1931, the New York bank failed, costing depositors $200 million. So it's the largest bank failure in history. But some 4,000 banks failed in 1933 alone, right? So just banks are just falling over the whole world over. And by some estimates, something close to 10,000 banks failed globally during the Great Depression and even a few years afterwards. So again, people's savings just getting wiped out. Just devastating, right? In July 1931, Germany closed all its banks and suspended conversion of its currency to any other currency and to gold, right? So Germany reacted very early and effectively walled itself off from the rest of the economy, rest of the world's economy. And eventually, and so this sent ripples of fear around the world, like the gold standard was failing, and that eventually every country in the world except France and the US had gone off the gold standard so they could devalue their currency. And those going off the gold standard also started to lift tariff barriers to imports. Not as high as Germany's, obviously, but tariff barriers, the the free trade environment was ending and tariff barriers were going up everywhere. And for the US and France, keeping their currency exchange fixed while everyone else was engaged in a competitive spiral of devaluations meant that they were flooded by ever cheaper imports from the rest of the world. So no domestic business could compete, so that hurt the US and French economies even more, until eventually in 1933 the US went off the gold standard, leaving France to come off a little time later as well. And so the day the dollar devalued or was taken off the gold standard, the US budget director, Lewis Douglas, famously said that this was the end of Western civilization. Right? So momentous thing, right? And the problem is that devaluing your currency only works if others aren't trying to devalue theirs as well, right? So currencies spiraled down against each other as each country tried to devalue more than the other, right? Or relative to everyone else, so as to get an economic boost. But because everyone's devaluing, no one's winning, everyone's losing. So all the industrialized states raise extreme tariff barriers or outright ban imports altogether. And even the UK, the champion of free trade for more than a century, formed an exclusive imperial trading bloc with its former colonies. Right? So the return of mercantilist economics. And for those without colonies to exploit, the ending of free trade denied them essential resources, right? So further threatening their economies. So German unemployment hit 44% in 1933, and so on the back of that, the Nazi Party wins the German election, and within a few months passes the Enabling Act, which removed the powers of Parliament and effectively gave Hitler dictatorial power. He immediately begins rearming Germany and advocating for a policy of Lieberstrom. Anyway, in German it means living space, right? Well, an explicit call for German expansion, right? They need colonies to exploit if they're going to survive this, right? Japan begins World War II with the invasion of China in 1937, right? Germany begins the war in Europe by invading Poland in 1939, right? So they haven't got colonies that they can draw on. So there is a connection between the ending of free trade or moving to this autarkic sort of system and the expansion of these powers, right? But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So international trade collapses, right? So this spiral graph on the right is the value of imports of 75 largest countries. So you can see that spiraling down, getting lower and lower from 1929 to 1933. And unemployment's just skyrocketing around the world. There's famines, poverty, everyone's lost their savings, just a horrible time. And that these economic pains translate directly into more radical politics. Right? So you can see the Nazi Party here, the rise in their vote corresponds very closely to the rise in unemployment. So, can you? I hate just reading slides to people when they can just read it themselves. So, could you pause the video and read this this quote from John Maynard Keynes? Okay, so I hope you did pause and read that. It's an important quote. So once countries were freed from having to impose austerity, to maintain the fixed rate to gold, the trade was still collapsing, right? And devaluations weren't helping you sell more, right? So that's not really the key. The key is that why going up to gold standard was so important is it meant that you were able to expand your money supply by lowering your interest rates to boost your domestic economy, rather than having to do the opposite to maintain the peg. So this, being able to expand the money supply, right, and boost your economy, quickly stopped the crippling deflation that was happening. So, for example, in the US, farmers were getting 35 cents for a bushel of wheat in March 1933. Then the US left the gold standard, lowers interest rates, and by mid-April, so they did that in mid-April, and so by July, so only April, May, June, July, so 3 months, right? It goes from 35 cents to 85 cents, right? So that's a huge leap. It's like 150%, is it? Oh, yeah, 150% in a increase in 3 months, right? So that's imagine your income increasing by 150% in a month or two, right? So massive. So all from the stimulation of demand that's generated by lowering interest rates, and which is allowed if you go off the gold standard, right? And you can see from the graph on the left that the US and France were the last to abandon the gold standard, and we can see from the graph on the right that fairly shortly after a country stopped maintaining their fixed to gold, their economies start to grow again, right? And so in the UK, this happened in late 1931, 2 years earlier, right, than the US. And they were able to stimulate their economy rather than impose austerity. And a big part of expanding the money supply was the government spending money on infrastructure and services, right? So President Roosevelt's New Deal, he spent $3.5 billion on 35,000 different major projects. And so this is creating millions of jobs, right? Giving them an income that they then spend on goods and services in other businesses, which creates, creates more and more jobs, and the economic machine gets going again. All democratic countries begin building welfare systems, right? So unemployment insurance and old age pensions come in, and healthcare, and not only that, it really cemented the idea that government intervention into the economy was not only was it not harmful, as in laissez-faire economics had believed, but it was actually required, right? And another interesting aspect of the recovery from the Great Depression is that there is a perfect correlation between whether a country was a net debtor country prior to the Depression and that country turning towards fascist or dictatorial governments. So that's quite remarkable, right? And it's because if you were a net debtor country, it hits you even harder, right? Because US money is withdrawn out of your economy and everything falls over, right? So every single one of those countries turns into fascist dictators, right? Or some, along the spectrum, right? So all over Europe, so 16 countries become dictatorships in Europe, and much of Africa and South America, Mexico, Japan, obviously, their democracy didn't survive the Depression. So economic hardship is very dangerous for a democracy, right? It makes people flock to strongmen who are going to have solve the problems, right? It makes politics much more extreme. So depressions are very damaging to democracies. However, these fascist dictatorships, right? And so by fascists I mean that there's a spectrum of intervention in the economy, and fascists there's still an economy, so it's not like the communists that removes the economy and it's all state-owned, but a fascist intervention is that profit is okay, right? Capitalist profit is okay, but the purpose of the whole society, business and profits is to build the state. Right? And so these sort of fascist, really new mercantilist economic strategies seem to work. They did work much better than the liberal democracies, where they were liberalizing, as in going back to free trade and opening up to external trade again. Right? All of these dictatorships and plus Soviet Union, they all turned inwards. Right? They kept their economies walled off from the rest of the world and attempted to achieve autarky, right, which is self-sufficiency, right? And it seemed to work, right? The fascists were much more successful than the democracies in rebuilding their economies, right? The industrial output in the UK and the US had barely made it back to its pre-depression levels by the late 1930s, right? But it had more than doubled in Germany, Poland, Japan, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, right? It had all doubled in all of these dictatorships. And it had more than quadrupled in the Soviet Union. So supposedly, there's some new figures about that. But so autarkic, fascist and authoritarian economics just seem far superior to free trading democracies. And there were several reasons for the economic success of the fascists. The first and most obvious is that the level of control able to be exerted. Right? So the fascists are using violence to achieve economic outcomes, right? Whereas a liberal democracy has to pull strings and manipulate things, but can't just directly order people to do things, right? Whereas, so for example, say Hitler said that inflation is a lack of discipline. I'll see to it that prices remain stable. That's what my stormtroopers are for. Woe to those who raise prices. We don't need legislation to deal with them. We'll do that with the party alone. You'll see, once our stormtroopers visit a shop to set things right, nothing similar will happen a second time. End quote. So the fascists crushed the labour unions and really instilled a reign of terror on the factory floor, right? So the normal problems of inflation once you hit full employment just aren't there, right? Because you're reducing the working class to slave labour, basically, or close to. The second reason why the autarkies were very successful in rebuilding fast was that they could keep their currency exchange rates very high, which in an open economy where you're concerned about your exports, it would hurt your exports, right? And it would make imports much cheaper, so you'd get flooded with imports. But these economies were closed, right? Imports weren't allowed, or they would do differing exchange rates depending on what product it was, right? So if you were importing, so if you were a domestic German manufacturer importing coal and iron ore, right, to make steel, to build things, you would get a very favourable exchange rate. But if you were a retailer importing, American-made jeans or something, then you would get a punishingly expensive exchange rate that would make the deal unprofitable, right? And so through those manipulations, though, the fascist regimes were able to really direct the economy away from consumption and into industrialization and keep wages low, right? And a third reason is that there was just so much direct investment by their governments in industries that they deemed important. So you might have heard of state-owned enterprises when discussing China. Well, so in Germany and the dictatorships of the 1930s, so these state-owned enterprises are released from the need to be profitable, right? And they can concentrate on producing the output that the government desires. So building dams, or electricity, or water, or roads, or rearmament, right? The need for profit is not there, right? So you can have massive overinvestment when you don't care about profit, right? So so that's the sort of thing that's what goes on in China now, right? So they, state-owned enterprises, they get preferable loans, they get subsidies, even markets are created so that they're a monopoly. Competing imports are kept out, wages are kept low for them. They don't even have to pay back the loans sometimes. So all these sort of things, right? And so by 1938, the Nazis had more than 500 really important state-owned enterprises, and over half of all investment being done by the government, over half of all investment into the economy was being done by the government directly. And 34% of GDP was being generated by the government, right? They were German workers, labour was crushed by all these dictators, right? It was not good to be working class in these regimes. So a German working class family was their wages weren't allowed to go up, right? And the costs of consumables and luxuries were all going up because the German regime wanted investment in industrializing, right? They didn't want it in blue jeans or something, right? So in all these ways, the fascists were able to turbocharge their industrialization. So Germany, under fascist rule, quickly goes from hyperinflation, middle class wiped out, to the industrial powerhouse pumping out more than the rest of the world combined, and quickly rearms, and as you saw from that quote I read before, the support base in small business and farmers and tradesmen and stuff. So flocking to the army, and it's just incredibly impressive, really, from an economic point of view. What this autarkic playbook was able to achieve. And the Soviet Union's version of autarkic economics saw the state take over the entire economy, right? So they are obviously the far end of the extreme, and Stalin was able to engineer what at the time appeared to be a miraculously quick industrialization of a formerly just a peasant economy, right? When the communists took over, the entire Russian economy was peasant farmers and small businessmen, right? Which is really difficult for a Marxist communist regime where the workers are supposed to unite, and farmers and small businessmen are the petty bourgeoisie that the workers are supposed to run out of town and take all their stuff, right? And so the 90% of the Russian economy, Lenin and Stalin saw as a threat to their support base, right? The idea behind communism was that the industrial workers were supposed to overthrow everyone, but in 1928 there wasn't any industry in Russia, so there wasn't any workers. There's no industrial workers. So when Lenin dies, Stalin takes over and he introduces his first 5-year plan, and he's convinced, probably quite rightly, that he's about to be attacked by one or all of the capitalist economies, and so he has a plan to industrialize Russia quickly, and so his first 5-year plan began with the collectivization of farming and enormous investments in heavy industry, particularly steel making. Obviously vital for this new industrial era age, war making. So in 1928, 97% of farmland was privately owned, but by 1936, 91% of it is run by collectives, and by 1940 there's just no privately owned property or farms. So, and Stalin purged the wealthiest peasants in every village, so they were all called out for being too wealthy and bourgeoisie. So they are all disappeared. So so if you take out all the really successful farmers and leave all the really bad ones and put them together, output's probably going to decline, right? Which it did. And plus the forced collectivization of the remaining peasants was fiercely resisted, and so these farmers would rather kill all their animals or eat their animals or sell them rather than give them over to the state, right? So figures of the stock of cattle and pigs and farm animals and stuff dropped by 50 to 75% during this time. And the agricultural output of the Soviet Union just crashed, right? And so you've had massive famine, and some. So you have 12.5 million citizens or people leave the farms and go to the cities, providing labour for the new factories, and it's just Stalin's forcefully turned a peasant society into an industrial powerhouse in 10 years. And during that time and afterwards, extravagant claims were made and continued to be issued until the late 1980s as to the GDP growth and industrial output that was achieved through this period. But when historians got access to Soviet files after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union, it was only then revealed that the true rate of growth in production over that period, or the period of the first 2 5-year plans, was only about 3.5% per annum. So about the same as Germany over that same period, which is impressive because it's still extremely impressive because the German population were highly educated. They were already an industrial powerhouse before, and then they've become one again. Whereas this, like, Stalin's got a peasant economy, right? And he forces them, killing millions and millions and millions, but forces them to become this industrial powerhouse, right? So, and he's done it almost. He's done it with the Soviet economy being almost completely sealed off from foreign trade, and he's really only been able to do that because, unlike Germany, he has a lot of oil, coal, natural resources, right? And 3.5% is far superior to the performance of the Western democracies, right? At the same time, but the human costs in Germany and especially the Soviet Union just immense, right? Obviously Stalin's one of the greatest monsters humanity's ever produced. Workers became virtual slave labour in the Soviet Union, right? So leaving a job wasn't allowed, and there were severe punishments for missed quotas and things like that. So he's really just force marching the Soviet people into industrialization. So, while the dictatorships of the 1930s were different in many details, they were all trying to achieve high levels of self-sufficiency. They were anti-free trade, and were extremely interventionist. And they threw all their available resources at industrializing quickly. The fascists did it by crushing labour. The communists did it by crushing capitalists and small business owners and farmers and labour. Both rejected global integration in favour of autarky and almost total control of their economies. Right? But in the industrial West, a coalition of labour, farmers and progressive capitalists replaced the laissez-faire minimal government with a new social democracy that managed and invested into the economy in order to maintain full employment while providing a welfare state and government services. Right? So in the lead up to World War II, you've got the three alternatives. You've got social democracies, you've got your fascists, and you've got your communists. So the differing ideologies were now in place as Germany and Italy and Japan started World War II, which we'll look at next week. So on that happy note, I will leave it there. I hope you found that interesting. Stay safe and well, and I'll talk to you in the next lecture.